Talking about who was hired while I was dean, and I just looked at the list of faculty here. Actually, I hired Dan Dobbs, John Strong, uh,
Good
while I was
hires.
dean. Dan was visiting here, and of course I give Joe Livermore credit for that, but we offered Dan a job while I was dean. He was the first Rosenstiel professor that we hired, and John Strong was the second. Now John was hired while I was dean, but he didn't actually come on board until Paul Marcus had taken over. But John is finishing up some things at the University of Nebraska, where he is the vice chancellor. So at least, they have made a great contribution, and of course have stayed here. So.
Professor Henderson, can you tell me what was the biggest change that you've seen in legal education since 1983?
Since 1983. Well, that's a tough one. I think society has grown much more complex, and particularly in the last 5 or so years with the so-called information technology and all of those things. But even prior to that, for example, the environment and the federal legislation and all the counterpart legislation at the state level, the attempts to clean up the environment, that in turn in some ways has helped spawn a lot of litigation with regard to what we now refer to as toxic torts. One time it was kind of hard to bring those cases as a private cause of action, but the rules of civil procedure have been changed, so you can bring class actions now. Many things have been done. So those are just some of the examples of the change in society, and I've always said law is going to reflect changes in society. So just with the more complex, business, social, whatever else you want to call it, world out there, law reflects that. And that in turn is reflected in the curriculum. So we now have, several courses in environmental law. We have courses in international commercial transactions because we're dealing now in a world, economy, a world market. The latest craze is this information technology, much of which is spawned by the internet and a lot of those things. So if you look at probably the biggest changes in legal education, it is that we now are offering a lot of different courses that reflect those changes in society. And those courses tend to be electives. Not all students take them, but the diversity and the richness of the curriculum, I think, has changed a lot. When I went to law school, there was no such thing as environmental law because there was no statutes out there. There was very little in the way of civil rights law. The Supreme Court of the United States had begun to constitutionalize the criminal process, and those changes were well underway with the Warren Court. But there were many, many things that today, as I look at our curriculum, they weren't even on the horizon. And all of this is a reflection, I think, of the complexity of modern day life.
Okay, we're in the year 2000. Now, if you get to change one thing about legal education currently, what would it be?
Well, I'm not sure what I would do. I in a way, I hesitate to ask or to answer the question because, we're all have a tendency to, I think, at least those things that were successful that we were involved in, we want to perpetuate them. Yet, sometimes those are the very things that are an impediment to what younger people, new people want to do. And I don't want to end up my academic career being one of the crumpets sitting around complaining about the place going to hell, because even though every generation has said that about the next generation, we haven't gone to hell yet. And certainly legal education today is much better. I think the law students today get a much better legal education than I got.
How do they get a better legal education?
Well, in terms of the quality of the instruction, the fact that just we were talking a moment ago about having women and minorities. When I went to law school, there were no women on the faculty. I assure you there were no minorities. There are hardly any minorities in the law school. So I think people come out of law school not only better educated because their teaching techniques are better, they see a variety of not only approaches, but they also get a variety of perspectives. And what I was getting was sort of the white, male, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant vision of the world. And although that stood me in good stead in terms of being able to adapt to change, I thought the law school did a very good job. I think that today, if I were to go back to the University of Texas Law School and see what's going on there, I would say, well, gee, this is a better process than when I went to school there. Mm-hmm. And I think the same is true of the University of Arizona. So if there's anything I could change about it, I'm not sure that there's any one thing. I will say this, that I hope that it will never crystallize, that it will always be a dynamic process. But I'll just mention a couple of things that have concerned me, and whether or not I'm being a crumpet, I'll let other people judge. I have been concerned about the grading system. For example, today an A is not what it was 20, 25 years ago. 25 years ago or so, 30 years ago, top 10% of the class at most would get A's, and I took courses in law school where the professor didn't feel like anybody deserved an A. No one got an A. Now that was pretty rare, but there was might be a class of 75, there wouldn't be any more than 4 or 5 A's. Today we give 25% A's, we get 55% B's. I understand the cultural situation. We're told that, gee, other law schools are doing this, and if we have, tighter standards, then it hurts our graduates. So if you're talking about legal education in general, I'm not sure we're being entirely honest when we say, gee, this particular paper or what have you is of the quality that we would reserve for the very, very best. Mm-hmm. And so at some point you're dipping down into what would be a B plus, and sometimes I think even B's, and we call those A's today. And there's an apocryphal story that I'll tell you. Harvard changed its grading system one year while I was there, and they also loosened it up. And the story is that a student went to see Professor Fuller, who was an old, kindly gentleman, very outstanding professor, a giant in many ways. And the student said to Professor Fuller, Professor Fuller, I just don't understand how I could have gotten an F in contracts, and I got A's in all my other first-year courses. I got an A in property, I got an A in torts, I got an A in civil procedure, I got an A in this, and in contracts, in your class, I got an F. And Professor Fuller was reputed to have said, well, my son, you have to understand, under the new grading system, there's not that big a difference between an A and an F. So, I don't know, when I say, gee, there's been this sort of inflation in grades, whether it's good or bad, but having grown up in a different system and having been an overachiever in that system and, done quite well academically, I sort of treasure the fact that maybe sometimes that I was the only person or 1 or 2 or 3 people in the class that got an A, and today I don't know about that. It makes me wonder how hard students work, whether or not if you're guaranteed pretty much a certain grade, that you might do less. I certainly don't believe in the interim approach and just scaring the hell out of them like in my day, but a little fear concentrates the mind, let me tell you. And you tend to, if you think you're going to lose a lawsuit, by golly, you're going to work a lot harder on it than you think if you got it in the bag. I think that's just human nature. But I'll let other people. I'm at the end of my career almost, so. But we have very bright students. There's no question about it. There is an argument for saying, well, gee, you know, why give only 10% A's to a group of people when there are more of them that are capable than 10% of getting A's? So.
My last question has to do with our graduates. Do you notice a difference now compared to back in the early 80s as to where they go in their careers after they graduate?
Well, part of this business of having our own placement operation and going out and recruiting recruiters and letting people know that we have a group of students here that recruiters might be interested in turn has caused our students to go all over the United States and sometimes the world. We always had a pipeline between Tucson and Washington, D.C., courtesy of Morris Udall. And many of our better students went to work in the Interior Department or went to work for Mo, and particularly when the Democrats had control of the House, as you know how it works back there, then you would have a Democrat as the chair of, say, the House Interior Committee. So as long as the Democrats were in control and Mo was chair of the committee, we had an opportunity there to place people. So if there's any one location outside of Arizona that we sent people to, it was Washington, D.C. And then, of course, those people might end up taking jobs with other government departments or law firms. But it wasn't that they didn't ever go anywhere else, because we have people like Dan Frost who went over to California and Los Angeles. There are other examples of people who went to other states. But once we got the recruiting process or the placement process operating, I'm just astounded at the number of people that come here to recruit. And so we send people, you know, we have people in Alaska, we have people in Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, Utah, Texas, I mean, you name it. I mean, we have people all over the United States today. And that is partly the result of that recruiting operation. It also is a reflection, I think, of just general mobility of society. And people are not born and live in one place. Look at our student body. I mean, you scratch the surface of these students, you're not going to find very many of them that were born in Arizona. They moved here sometime, some of them only recently to undergraduate school. Others grew up here, maybe went to high school or something like that. But people are just much more mobile today. I think the two-career family has a lot to do with it, because many of these students are either married or are marrying when they get out of school, or they have another relationship that causes them to have to think about, well, where can both of us go? And it's not just well, gee, we'll just settle down right here, and you know, whoever the primary wage earner in the family dictates that choice. So people just generally move around a lot more.
Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, it's been a good 20-some-odd years. I hope the next couple are just as good, and then I'll let somebody else run the place.
Thank you so much for your time.
It was great.